Good evening and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Symposium. I'm Diane Sayre, president of the LaRouche Organization, and we're going to continue something that we started last week, which is a discussion of the LaRouche case. Today is the last Friday in the year 2024. We will be entering a new year, hopefully a new paradigm. Hopefully we will survive until at least January 20th when President Trump is inaugurated. And after that, where we hopefully will organize a complete change in direction of the United States, which clearly some people are very afraid of. But I think the LaRouche case is one of the most important cases in all of the history of the United States and is, as Ramsey Clark, the former U.S. Attorney General, warned when he took the LaRouche case, saying that it was one of the broadest, longest range coordinated efforts to lay low a defendant that he had ever seen, that this would create a precedent. And I'm afraid it has, so that we saw in this presidential election year and in recent years, the quality of who is allowed to be a candidate leaves quite a great deal to be desired. True statesmen and leaders are not allowed to get anywhere near public office. And you see the FBI, Department of Justice, and media coordinating to smear anyone, black out, smear, arrest, raid, to prevent exactly that kind of debate. It is my view that the slandering of Lyndon LaRouche is one of the greatest crimes done to the American people because he was a universal genius. And because there's not one thing happening today anywhere on the planet that both he did not forecast and that he did not outline a solution to. Now, I just will bring up my guest today for a moment to say hello. This is Mike Billington, who himself is a longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche, a former political prisoner, one of the writers for Executive Intelligence Review, an author, and has done a great deal of work in Asia. So, Mike, before we go to Lynn's speech, if you have any thoughts you'd like to say about the current moment in history and the relevance of LaRouche, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, well, that's a small topic.
30 seconds or less.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the main thing to point out is what you hinted at already, which is that virtually every major positive development going out in the world today, from the Belt and Road to the work by the BRICS towards a new global financial system, to the building of major infrastructure in South America and Africa. These are all things forecast and promoted by Lyndon LaRouche. And he was listened to. He wasn't listened to in America that much, although, there are a lot of people in America who were indeed listening and are increasingly listening today. But around the world, LaRouche was recognized as a brilliant mind coming from America, despite what America was doing otherwise. And I think many people are recognizing that the positive things going on by the global South, the BRICS, and so on, these are things that came out of LaRouche's mind.
Thanks. So we'll come back to that. I'd like to take up a little bit about what happened in your case where you were given a 77-year jail sentence, etc. What we're going to do right now is watch about 15 minutes of an amazing press conference given by Lyndon LaRouche almost exactly 30 years ago today. This was, he got out of prison on Mozart's birthday, 1994, January 27th, 1994. We're now in 2024, so this is the 30th anniversary of LaRouche's release from 5 long years in federal prison of a 15-year jail sentence. And I just wanted to share this so you people get a sense of LaRouche's thoughts, the way that he thought about these things. So here we go. I'm just putting you there in case there are comments, and we're going to bring this on here. Let's see here.
I'd like to welcome everyone to this select gathering. My name is Mel Klinetsky, and today Lyndon LaRouche will give his first press conference since his parole, and he will be discussing his future plans. And without further introduction, let me give you Lyndon LaRouche.
I'll just make a few relevant observations which may be of interest, including for reason of things in Chicago, and then open this up to see what you have to ask. As you probably know, I have been a candidate for the 1996 Democratic Party presidential nomination for some period of time now. I understand one of my old campaigns is about to get approximately $500,000 of money, which will not affect the new campaign, but it will make some of our contributors from the past happier. My function in campaigning at this time I'm not so much concerned with 1996 as whether the world is going to get to that point in anything like reasonably decent shape or not. We have the worst crisis of the century developing, despite a burgeoning of so-called notional values in financial markets. We have the worst economic collapse of the century in progress. We are faced, despite some of the bula about recovery, with the collapse of tax revenue base throughout the United States per capita. We have a per capita collapse in real incomes, that if we talk about market baskets in physical terms plus education and healthcare, we're talking about a catastrophic collapse in the typical family income relative to, say, 1970, or perhaps in some cases 1973. The sum total of this is, in my view, both domestically and in matters of foreign concern, is that we in the United States, as well as other nations, took the wrong road in policy changes which began to occur about 1964, shortly after the death of President Kennedy. Not that I blame President Johnson for these changes, they were forced upon him in a very terrifying period then in the middle 1960s, with the death of Kennedy, the war in Vietnam, and so forth. But nonetheless, we've taken a turn which has failed miserably. We have at this moment a young president of the United States who is experiencing some difficulty. His virtue, as far as I've been able to see so far, is that he is much more open than his predecessor to considering policies. But he recently said he thought we ought to look at the wisdom of IMF policies or related policies toward Russia. Then his vice president, Al Gore, said something similar in Moscow. And then Strobe Talbot, his close confidant and State Department representative, said we should have less shock and more therapy on the Russian situation. And then a bunch of my, not friends, among the neocons, decided to go fishing in Whitewater to try to get the president off course on this thing. So I don't know whether President Clinton is going to have good policies or bad policies. He does have openness toward policy consideration, which I consider very good after the disaster of George Bush. And I would hope that not by my going to him and saying, please listen to me, but rather by, as a candidate and in related functions, stating publicly what I think the problems are and what should be done about them. I would hope that that would be helpful in shaping or contributing to shaping a very anguished, very frightening policy complex in the United States. That's my job. I shall, in the meantime, be doing my intelligence work in connection with news publication and related matters, particularly on the economy and a few other things. So I shall be busily occupied and happily occupied with a number of these projects. But I think the thing you're probably most concerned about is the political situation. Okay, throw them at. What have you got?
Yes, and please identify yourself.
Mr. LaRouche, my name is Kyle Cooper with WTOP Radio.
Yes, Gail.
Sir, how are you? You've spent 5 years in penitentiary. How are you personally? How do you feel?
Well, I've been through a bit of an ordeal. It's not the worst ordeal one can imagine. It has certainly crippled my ability to function effectively during this period. I have a short life. We all do. I'm coming toward the end of it. I tend to come from a long life family, which is rather appalling prospect to some of my adversaries, but I probably have 10 to 15 years of mileage left in me, and I'm concerned about how I'm going to use it. I think there's some things that are important to me in life that I will wish were attended to by the time I leave the life, and I'm going to do those things. And now I have some freedom to do these things as I had not in the same degree even approximately recently, and I'm very happy about that. Much better than the alternative. I'm in a fighting mood. I've got a lot of things tucked away I'm concerned about, but I think I've indicated what the leading concerns are. I'm very happy. I'm fighting.
Again from WPTG television here in Washington. Do you think prison changed you at all?
No, I became older, and age always changes one a bit, I've found. No more than the past 5 years and any 5 years preceding it. The only thing that I observed is I observed close up the way American public opinion in shaping our public judicial policy, our criminal justice system, is ignoring a number of facts which confront you when you look inside a prison population. There is a criminal justice policy which has taken on a life of its own, which is partly justified but partly not justified and in part greatly counterproductive. And I have become concerned about that, from seeing it close up and becoming a little bit of an expert, at least on one nook or cranny of the problem. I see people in prison, various degrees. I see a large proportion of Hispanic and African American young men in prison. I see them coming to prison in some cases virtually destroyed, in some cases half destroyed, and in some cases with a possibility, if they were given the opportunity, of finding something to uplift them so that when they hit the streets again, they have hope. I see other people in prison who are becoming demoralized and embittered, largely because there is no intellectual life in prison of the type which would make people better, which would inspire them, which would prevent them from becoming bittered. So what we're doing with our prison policy at present, we're putting people in prison, we're destroying a significant section of the poorest part of the population, Hispanic and African American. We are driving some people who are going to turn on the streets eventually into embittered people who will explode at some point after being released. I don't think the American people want that result. I don't think they're thinking about it. I think Americans who are justly angered by muggings, by burglaries and other things are frightened. They want something done about some of these problems. But we've got to think about the fact that we have 0.5% approximately of our population incarcerated in this country now. Given the crime rate and the rate it's likely to rise under present economic trends, we're headed toward 1%, 2%, or 3% of the population either in prison or in some form of restraint as a result of convictions. We better think about what we're doing to cause the problem, how we could ameliorate the problem, and we better think more carefully about the kind of people we're going to be putting out in the street after 3, 4, 5, or 10 years of incarceration. That I've learned. And that message I don't intend to go running around as a prison reformer, but when somebody on Capitol Hill or somebody in the news media wants my opinion about prison, I'll be very happy to elaborate on that message.
For the record, you appealed your conviction. For the record, do you still say that the government persecuted you, that you did no wrong in the fraud case?
Well, let's put it this way, because this is the way that you can factually check it. The fact is, as a letter from Ramsey Clark and Odin Anderson to the Fourth Circuit indicated, summarized the case, and as the same point was made summarily to the Justice Department recently, is that the record shows at present, that is the official public record accessible to anybody who cares to investigate it, that at all times relevant to the period of the indictment, from 1979 to the present, the government at all times knew that I and my co-defendants were completely innocent of the charges brought against us, and that the government, the prosecution, acting for the government, by means of lying, by suborning of perjury, by suppressing exculpatory evidence, and similar means, brought about a conviction through a massive fraud upon the court. So far, the status is that the Fourth Circuit and the courts have refused or declined to hold a hearing on the evidence, which takes about 6 volumes of evidence showing that these facts I just indicated. And the Justice Department, as yet, has not begun the inquiry into this misconduct by government officials which the case involved. This is the kind of thing, I don't know what term to characterize. I say this is the kind of thing that happens when you become a significant adversary. They think you're becoming too powerful in Washington, and they decide they're going to try to destroy you. And they had 2 choices: shoot me or try to defame me and incarcerate me for a while. So they told the latter. It didn't work. I've got more influence, I think, in the world today than I had 5 years ago, and I'm back. That's the way I would characterize it.
Yes.
So I just want to pause it right there, Mike, and get your thoughts. Lynn has said a great deal, starting with his comments on the economic collapse, the political situation, the question of relations with Russia, the question of targeting of Bill Clinton, because Strobe Talbot apparently said that we should have less shock and more therapy or something like that with Russia, to the jail situation, to the political witch hunt. And I'd like to just get your thoughts. And then also in that, maybe you can say something about what happened in the trial, why Lynn could say so confidently that these people never believed that he or any of the defendants were guilty.
Let me add one thing to what Lynn said about I sort of lost my train of thought. The judicial policy of incarcerating and basically putting huge numbers of people, as he said, mostly Hispanic and Black, in warehouses. They were not put in to be rehabilitated. They often call these prisons rehabilitation centers. They're not. They're not intended to be. And in fact, any step towards trying to change that or to contribute something to prisons is crushed by the people who are responsible to the Justice Department to keep these prisons in the condition they're in. And Lynn saw this up close. I received stories from people who were in prison with Lynn, who then got transferred to prisons I was on the East Coast, who described that Lynn would come out after dinner, and there were a series of benches along the walkway there, and the inmates would sit in these benches, and Lynn would walk up and down, lecturing the way he does, the way those of you who have heard Lynn lecture before tonight, covering every aspect of human history, science, culture, music, art, science especially, and he would give these lectures. And one of the young men, a young mafia type character from New York, but who very much admired LaRouche and used to go for walks with him, And he said sometimes some of these stupid inmates would come up and say, "Oh, you're full of this and that," or something like that. And I just turned to them and I'd say, "Shut up. You're going to learn something. Just pay attention. Use your time wisely. Learn something from this guy." And I mean, this is definitely the case, is that there was nothing like a LaRouche. Certainly, there was nothing like a LaRouche anywhere in the country. But there was nothing like that in prison, that's for sure. Or even worse, there was nothing of any sort. There was a very feeble educational system where you could get your GDE, your high school equivalency, if you worked at it. And people did do that. That was about the only access to anything useful that you could do. But if there was some effort to introduce beauty or culture, it would be crushed. And at one point, Paul Gallagher, many of you know Paul Gallagher. I'm sure he's been on your symposium, Diane. He's the economics editor for the Executive Intelligence Review and one of the longest standing members of the organization working with Lyndon LaRouche. He and I ended up in the same prison in Virginia. And under his coaching, he encouraged me to open up a chorus in the prison, which we did together. We recruited these about 20 of these young men, some of whom were very, very serious criminals, no question, but many of whom were, simply subject to the kind of culture we lived in and got led astray for various reasons and ended up in prison. But in any case, we started a chorus. I had learned through a maestro from Mexico, Jose Briano, who became an associate of LaRouche and who came up from Mexico and worked with our chorus. Yeah.
Just so people know, or people who are just joining us, I did mention you were a political prisoner, but everyone may not be aware that you were in prison for nearly 11 years. Is that correct?
10 years, yeah.
10 years. So you're speaking.
I was sentenced to 77 years. I didn't serve quite 77 years, but I was in for 10. Yeah, Lynn was in for 5 years. Lynn served 5 years in prison, and several of my associates, including Paul Gallagher and others, served somewhat shorter periods, but nonetheless significant, several years each. And we're faced with the same dilemma that Lynn described, that these were warehouses where people were just being shoved into cells and told to rot with very little to do except maybe getting out into the rec yard and running around and playing baseball or football or something, but no opportunity for anything else. And that's why Paul especially insisted that we had to do something to introduce beauty and culture. And we did. And we started this chorus. These people knew nothing about classical music. They knew very little about music. But we taught them Bach and Mozart and Brahms and Beethoven. We sang great classical choral pieces and worked hard on them. Some of them had to work very hard to get their voices to even match tones and so forth. But eventually we reached the point where we were able to present a legitimate version of great music. The most important we did was the so-called Prisoner's Chorus, which is a scene from the Beethoven's only opera, Fidelio, in which the prisoners are released out into the open air from their cells for a very brief time. But they are left out and they sing about, oh, what joy, oh, welche Lust. Oh, what joy to breathe the fresh air and to at least have this sense of freedom again. And it's a very powerful male chorus. So we sang that. And that especially really reached into these young men's hearts and souls. That piece in particular, but all of this music. As I said, when we did a Christmas concert and actually performed for the church on the compound, I told the audience that the people in my chorus had asked if it was okay for them to dress up like real prisoners, and I said, indeed, yes, you can dress up like real prisoners, which they did. But more important is that this music did penetrate. It was heard by people who've never heard this kind of music. And after this, every one of the members of that chorus at some point came up to me just to express the fact that they'd never experienced anything like this in their lives, that they'd never participated in something that was actually creating beauty, and that they were taking part in the creation of that beauty. So, I mean, these are things that I haven't had any contact with any of them, with one exception, since we got out of prison. But I'm certain that their lives were transformed, and the prison tried to crush it. The prison tried to stop our doing this horrible thing that was diverting their attention from being punished into actually using their mind and their creative powers. So this is the problem. This is what Lynn is pointing at, that many of the people in there were being created or desecrated in such a way that when they did get out of prison, when they came back to the street, as they like to call it, that they would be far worse off than they were before they went in. And many, of course, would go back to crime. I'm sure you've all heard about the recidivist rate and so forth. But more importantly, their lives were not enhanced. There was no rehabilitation. And this is where what we have to do in society in general, not just in our prisons, but in society in general, where people have no familiarization with beauty, certainly almost no opportunity to participate in beauty, which is one of the reasons that we've created choruses all over the country. Diane is I think the founder of the New York City Schiller Institute Chorus, and the director of that chorus. And everywhere we go, and we have gone throughout the country and throughout the world, while we lay forth the political parameters of what's required, of what's wrong with the system that we're involved in, which is in the midst of economic disintegration. And it's this economic disintegration that's driving the world towards global war. But in those conditions, you nonetheless have to if you want to resolve those political and economic disasters, you have to create a cultural renaissance. You have to give people a sense of an uplifting sense that regardless of the horrible conditions that we're living through today, that we can and we must work together to bring about a new just world economic order, a new architecture for security and development, as Helga calls it. And to do that, we have to create a cultural renaissance. You have to get people to start thinking at a higher level, at a different level, in a different way, to start thinking about what they can do and must do to create a better world for themselves and their families and their country, but for the world in general.
Could you say a little bit, because many people who've only come to know LaRouche recently, I mean, we were just saying it was 30 years ago this year that he got out of prison. So many younger people have no idea what the charges were, why he was considered to be such a threat. How on earth you managed to get a 77-year jail sentence? Maybe you could say something about this process?
Well, I mean, as Lynn said in the clip that you showed from his press conference when he got out of prison, the evidence is absolutely overwhelming that the government knew we had committed no crimes of any sort. They knew that. The point was that LaRouche was a great danger to their power. How? By exactly what I just described. By unleashing in the population a sense of reason, a sense of history, a sense of culture. And when people reach that higher level of reason, they're not going to tolerate the kind of economic and cultural disintegration that is being foisted on the human race today, or at least in the Western world. We have, to our benefit, the fact that most of the world has already long since rejected this policy. The so-called global South, the vast majority of the developing countries, with the inspiration coming to a great extent from the BRICS countries, which includes especially China and Russia and India and other countries. Now 40 or 50 countries who want to be part of this BRICS movement. But these are countries who they're rejecting colonialism. They've been subjected to their countries being kept backwards in order to serve as sources for raw materials for the Western countries, for their industries, but not getting paid for them, not even getting paid in money, let alone in development. And now you have something else coming from the BRICS and from the Chinese, especially with their Belt and Road process, which is effectively taking the American system concept, the American system that LaRouche has championed throughout his political life, the ideas of Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin and John Quincy Adams and Lincoln and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, people who, those handful of great presidents, and there's only a few who actually followed the American system idea, but that idea was that you had to create the culture, the education, and the infrastructure that's needed for a nation to become a modern industrial nation rather than a poor agriculture only and primitive agriculture at that, which is what was being done to most of the third world under the colonial system. And that's being rejected absolutely. It has a great deal to do with Lyndon LaRouche personally. He spent a good portion of his life in the third world, in Africa, in South America, and a great deal of time as well in India and in Russia, and educated people there on the ideas of the American system, which was represented by only a handful of people in the world today, with LaRouche being the greatest of those figures, but taught them that this was what they could do with their country. And these are the ideas now being implemented. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the late 1980s and early 1990s, LaRouche went to Russia. He was invited there. People there had been following his writings. He was invited. He spoke at the Duma, at their parliament. He spoke to the Russian Academy of Sciences with scientists there who recognized LaRouche's brilliance in science as well as in culture. And these ideas took hold and they blossomed over years. Didn't always happen right away, but it is happening. Not only did the Chinese adopt the idea that Lynn and Helga presented as the so-called Eurasian land bridge, and that developed into what's now known as the Belt and Road Initiative, which is taking these great infrastructure development projects to the rest of the world and telling the former colonies, impoverished, backwards, you don't have to be like this anymore. You can do what we did in China, where we lifted 800 million people out of poverty by building a massive infrastructure project, which lifted the productivity of every single member of that society. And the Belt and Road is taking that process, building ports, building railroads, building schools, building hospitals, basically saying you too can become a modern nation rather than an impoverished so-called third world country. And that is what they've adopted. That's why they're all turning away from the West, away from the sanctions policy and the use of the dollar as a weapon rather than as a means of credit, and to join together with other nations with this concept of building a new global infrastructure based on people being human beings, of having the dignity of humanity, to develop every child's capacity to develop his creative powers of mind through study, through education, through science, through music, through culture, and their own cultures as well. This isn't to say that we wanted to impose our culture per se. The idea was every culture has moments of greatness in their history, and getting every citizen of every country to learn to love other cultures is one of the centerpieces of what the LaRouche idea was, that so infuriated the powers that be, the people that ran the already bankrupt Western financial system, who recognized that getting the truth out and organizing international forces to replace this was a great danger to them. That's what led to their creating this fake trial, fake conditions in which they, I won't even try to go through it. It's not worth going through. Although, let me mention that one of the things I did in prison was that I wrote this book, which is called Reflections of an American Political Prisoner, The Repression and Promise of the LaRouche Movement. So this is by me. This is a reflection. It's not a definitive history of LaRouche and the LaRouche movement, but it is, at least from my perspective, it's a history of the last 40 years approximately of the building of the LaRouche movement. And you can still get this on, Amazon. You can buy this book on Amazon. I encourage you to read it. It's very useful to know this deeper history, especially, as Diane mentioned, for those of you who are younger, who are less than 70 or 80, like some of us, who don't remember this history yourself. It's a good way to read that history rather than the fake history that you tend to get from, certainly from the news media, but unfortunately also from our universities.
I wanted to bring up, because I think the tension today is extremely great, because what Lynn forecasts, the transatlantic system, is done. As you were saying, it's really over. And there's a whole new dynamic among nations. And in fact, the Eurasian Economic Union just met, I guess, in the last couple of days in Russia, which has included for the first time Iran as an observer, but included heads of state of Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Kyrgyzstan. And they're making all kinds of agreements on trade zones and energy and this and that. And one of the leading commissioners at the Eurasian Economic Union is Sergei Glaziev, who came to know LaRouche, I think, initially when he was stationed. He was a student in the United States and was told that he should avoid LaRouche, have nothing to do with him. And he said, "What is this, the Soviet Union?" So he decided to attend seminars with LaRouche, study LaRouche, and in fact has himself credited LaRouche's ideas, as you did, with much of the success of the BRICS process. But it seems to me, if the United States were in our right mind, we would actually be rejoicing at the end of colonialism, not trying to crush it, not trying to be a carbon copy of the old British Empire.
Yeah, exactly. And this is what's true of China. I mean, it's very important for people to be informed of the fact that China, unlike what you read about in your newspapers and hear from our crazy political leaders that this is some threat to America. I mean, what China has done is truly a miracle of history. They rose from being one of the poorest countries on earth, and through adopting policies that in fact are based on what we know as the American system, using ideas of people like Alexander Hamilton to drive the credit of the nation into building infrastructure, those things that uplift the productivity of everyone because of the transportation, the energy, the education, the health systems, those things that become available to the population at large and basically uplift each and every person, both personally and as citizens of their nation. And they did that. But even more important is what they're doing with the Belt and Road, something that got started again from the LaRouche ideas. The LaRouche, Lyndon and Helga LaRouche promoted the idea of what they called at the time the Eurasian Land Bridge, building high-speed rail connections between the Atlantic and the Pacific through Eurasia as a way of uplifting, and especially uplifting the central part of Eurasia, which is the sort of barren and less populated, less developed areas, through development corridors, like America did by building the Transcontinental Railroad. Exactly the same idea. And these policies were adopted within China, and then they decided to take this out to the rest of the world, building rail connections between China and Europe, but also down through Southeast Asia, and through Central Asia, and then eventually into Africa. But the idea is connecting the world technologically and through rail connections, literally connect them into a grid throughout the entire world. So these are ideas that if we would participate in them, then the fact that we have huge industries that are now boarded up and collapsed. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. When I go back to Cleveland, or when my parents were still alive and I visit occasionally, I drive down through what they call the flats in Cleveland, which is where I worked as a college student in the summers, worked in the steel mills, U.S. Steel and Republic Steel, and that's helped pay my way through college. But, learning the steel industry was one of the great things that I learned, even though I was doing this basically to have a job to pay for school. But in the process, I learned something about one of the most modern industries in the world, the U.S. steel industry. And now you drive down through these areas and these old steel plants are just boarded up. And the Cleveland is the center of the collapse of housing. People being losing their mortgages and being driven out of their homes. I mean, it's just a horror show. All they have is their sports stadiums and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. We once had one of the great concert systems in the world with the Cleveland Symphony. And I'm sure that's still alive. But the fact is, people are not given access to that any more than the young people in my prison had access to classical music until we brought it to them. And unfortunately, that's true in our inner cities that have been destroyed because we're doing away with modern industry. We've turned instead to speculation. Our children are taught how to gamble online and in the stock market. And this is considered business. They call this business. Well, it's not business. Financial speculation is not business. It's not building a nation. It's not building productivity. It's effectively gambling. And we've turned our nation and the world, the Western financial system, into a great big gambling casino. And people are taught, well, you want to do better than your parents? Become a gambler. You can make money speculating on derivatives in the stock market. So why worry about production? Who cares about production? So this is, if we were to restore that American commitment to productivity and to production and to science, and to join with the BRICS in building nations, in building new ports like they just built in Peru with the Chancay port there, then we would be reactivating our industries. We would be redeveloping these collapsing cities like Cleveland and Pittsburgh and Detroit, which would become valuable again in producing the things needed to create nations around the world. I mean, this is the task we have before us today in America.
I think one big problem is restoring trust. If I were a leader of another country, I would be very hesitant to trust the United States in anything. And I think the exoneration of Lynn actually would go a very long way toward addressing that. And how can you trust someone who doesn't even admit when they have violated agreement upon agreement, such as the non-expansion of NATO? And in that regard, I think it is promising that Trump said with Robert Kennedy Jr. standing next to him that he would finally release the files on the Kennedy assassination. I think that should be done sooner than later. Do you have thoughts on this question?
No, absolutely. Putin actually responded to that by saying, or no, I guess it wasn't. Putin has said this in the past, but I think it was Helga who said, not only the JFK files to reveal how our justice system carried out the assassination of one of our greatest presidents, and in order to launch the disintegration of our nation, but that in fact we should release all the documents of World War I and World War II and find out how we actually spent the 20th century as a war of genocidal hell all over the world, in Europe as well as in Asia. Getting that truth out and the criminality of Wall Street and the City of London, the banking center in the UK and in the United States, as the warmongers, which now it's much easier for people to see. They can recognize that the so-called military-industrial complex that Dwight Eisenhower warned about is running our economy. Why else do we have permanent warfare all over the world? How many bases do we have? It's more than 80 bases, I think it is, around the world.
It's about 1,000.
1,000? Okay.
Yeah. I forget how many. We're building new bases in Syria. I think we have 11 or 12 or 17 bases in Syria alone. 17 now in Sweden since they joined NATO. Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Yeah. So these are obviously not anything that's contributing to the production of any part of the world. They contribute only to the destruction of the world. That's what the military-industrial complex is. But it's making a lot of money for the people on Wall Street, because the military-industrial complex is all owned by Blackwater and JP Morgan. It's owned by Wall Street and by the City of London. And they're making lots of money. But this is a tiny, tiny proportion of the human race making money out of murder, out of mass death. And now you have that really exposed around the world. Of course, you have the case of Gaza now in front of everybody's eyes, where they can watch on TV every night an act of outright genocide, like we had under the Nazis in the 1930s and 40s. And yet this is portrayed as one of our allies, one of our friends. And those people who protested are accused of being anti-Semites and thrown in prison in many cases.
Exactly. Now I want to go to the last 5 minutes of this Lynn press conference, because you're touching on some of the things that he says there, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay.
So you'll see this. Hold on a second.
Yes, these people were victimized. They're all innocent. The Virginia case is a special case. They were one of these cases, really an ex post facto.
6 of your associates are still in long-term prison sentences in Virginia. said that you were going to fight for their and your exoneration. Can you comment?
Well, it's obvious that these people were victimized. They're all innocent. The Virginia case is a special case. They were one of these cases, really an ex post facto law and a fraud by Mary Sue Terry's crowd with ADL. The ADL and Mary Sue Terry fixed up this fraud, which put these people in prison. That's a matter of the record. But the obvious thing is that people these days, because of the life of its own in the criminal justice system, are loath to do anything for justice. For example, take the fake cases in Virginia, like the recent treatment of the Earl Washington case, or the Herrera case in Texas, and the Supreme Court decision on the Herrera case, is that we can have innocent people in prison on death row whom the government knows by virtue of evidence available to either be innocent or have strong, colorable claims to innocence. And yet they will say they must be executed for the sake of policy, even though we have proof they're innocent. So the fact that you are being abused in prison or innocent is not a reason that you're automatically freed. And thus, what I think is a clear, since the whole business centers around a Get LaRouche campaign, obviously my own exoneration will open the jail cells for my fellow victims of this kind of process. And there are things that go with that, other deeds that have to be done, but that's the essential part of it. As long as I was in prison, it was extremely difficult to get any justice for my friends who had been unjustly incarcerated. And now that I'm out, of course, I'll be doing something about that. The fact is, it's on the record, it's no longer debatable, it's no longer speculative. The evidence is there. The federal government and the state government, in prosecuting these cases, lied from beginning to end. And that's a matter of fact which anybody can determine for themselves by going down, for example, to the Fourth Circuit records and looking at the file where the evidence is there. There's no question about it. So that's the issue. Once people realize there is no debate, there's not a debatable issue, that no person who's competent can honestly say that one of these people is actually guilty. Once that issue is forced out in the open, as the campaign will do, for, among other things, then they're going to be freed, and soon.
Yes, sir.
Will you be maintaining your base of operations in Montana?
Well, for the time being, I'm a rather adaptable person, as my prison experience has demonstrated, and I will do whatever is necessary on the more or less the drop of a hat, as I always have. But right for now, I'll be, base of operations for me is doing work. I spend about 14 hours a day working. I'll get up at odd hours in the morning, sometimes 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning, and go into an office, which is handy to the bedroom, which is living over the stores of where I live, and get onto a computer or do some other work, which I can complete in the silence and privacy of that moment. And that'll go on with a few interruptions and diversification throughout the day. So I'm just happily sitting in an office, living over the store, writing documents, doing research, engaging in conversations, and having meetings with people who come to visit me. And that I'll be doing in Loudoun County, as far as I can tell, for the foreseeable future.
Thank you all very much.
So,
Well, not only will, if with the exoneration of LaRouche, not only will all the innocents currently populating our prisons have their cases renewed, or at least the issue be renewed, but this is, as everybody now knows, this is also true about our wars. We fight wars based on lies. And the same Justice Department in the City of London and Wall Street and so forth, who own the military-industrial complex, also own the media and create the lies, which unfortunately people, even though they know they're lies, people know what they're reading in the newspapers. They knew from the beginning of the Iraq War that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. This was all totally lies. The whole Russiagate operation against Trump was just an extension of the operation against LaRouche, making up stories about what Russia was doing. And people know this. This is not unknown. But what do they do about it? They throw up their hands and they say, well, yeah, but this is the way it is. This is the system. How are you going to change that? And this is where we have to make clear that indeed it is the system, and therefore you're not going to fix this little piece by little piece. We have to change the system. We have to restore a system which is based on the dignity of man and the humanity of man, and not the power of military or financial power. So this is where we stand today, and this is where you have to do the hard work, like this movement does, like your efforts are, Diane, through the LaRouche movement, to bring about that kind of a cultural and intellectual change, which will enlighten people to see that we can and we must create a new global architecture based on security and development, and the potential development of the mind of every single young child now being buried under the rubble in Gaza or anywhere else they are. So this is our task.
Mike, I want to thank you very much for joining, and we'll, I'm sure, have more discussions. I want to encourage people who watch this conversation to please like, share, subscribe, donate to the LaRouche organization. And with any luck, I hope to see all of you next week when we will be the beginning of 2025. In the interim, please get on the phone, call your congressional offices. We have to stop this policy of provoking Russia. And I should just add that Iran is working very closely with Russia and China. It is not going to be overthrown as Syria was, and people should think twice about encouraging Bibi Netanyahu to launch strikes on Iran. It's not going to work so well for the Israelis. So again, thanks very much, Mike. His book for everyone is called Reflections of a Political Prisoner. That's Michael Billington, longtime LaRouche associate, spent 10 years in prison as a political prisoner. And I'm Diane Sayre, and we will see you all next week.